All right, we're picking up verse 8, which we concluded last week. We didn't go over our questions in order from our notes, but we did actually, through the process of the class, we actually answered all the questions. The only one we really didn't cover was question 5. Why do you suppose we quote and refer to verse 7 so much as Christians, and what lessons are there for us? And obviously, as we discussed last week, verse 7 and 8 are kind of combined together. We talk about the comfort that we get from verse 7, knowing that it's all worth it, that the fight is a good fight, it is a beautiful fight, it's a worthy fight. The race is worth finishing. And certainly the faith is worth keeping. And so those lessons, obviously, as we kind of drew some application last week, is that at the end of our lives, whenever that may be, at any given point, really, we should be able to make this statement. Certainly, generally, we don't see death coming for us. And so we need to be able and be prepared to be able to make this statement that Paul makes here in verse 7 and verse 8. And of course, we see the confidence that he has in his own faith and service to the Lord. And that's part of what question 6 was about. How can Paul so confidently say that there is a wreath or a crown of righteousness laid up for him? What was it about? Because a lot of times there may be points in our lives where we wonder, where we ask the question, if I were to die right now, would I have a home in heaven at judgment? How is it that Paul was able to be so confident in the statement that he makes in verse 8? Is he bragging? Is he unduly exalting himself here, or claiming that in some form or fashion that he is owed a crown of righteousness? Okay.
He's been just as staunch in his work for the Lord as he was in his work against the Lord. Not that he's owed it, but he has been doing what he's supposed to do.
Okay.
And if God is the righteous judge, which he is, at whatever point Paul in his life would have sinned, he obviously would have repented and taken care of that. And so God's righteousness to reward him is based upon Paul simply doing what he's supposed to do and obey.
Okay. So then Paul's confidence is based on God's promise then, right? The fact, just as Joe mentioned, the reward that is waiting for those who fulfill what God has told them to do. And the example or the character of Paul never changed in the fact that even when he was under the Mosaical law and he was still serving that law, thinking that that was what was right, he was in all good conscience doing so. But then when he learned the truth, he put just as much effort and just as much determination and commitment into serving the Lord as he did in serving the law. And certainly the promise of God is what is Paul's basing the statement on in verse 8. It's not Paul's declaring himself to be owed a crown, and it's not Paul exalting himself. It is on the basis of the promise that God has made to all those who are faithful, and Paul has been faithful. And so obviously when Paul makes a statement at the end of verse 8, that not to me only, but to all those who have loved his appearing, what is going to be a part of that to those who have loved his appearing? Obviously, whether we're talking about having loved Jesus' coming to this earth and the gospel in a nutshell, Jesus coming to this earth, dying for us, being raised from the dead, obviously the plan of salvation, but also when he comes again, the confidence, the boldness to be able to stand before the throne of God, the acknowledgement of those who are faithful that they have a promise and a home in heaven. Obviously, those who have loved his appearing, what will then they do if they have loved his appearing? Or what will they have done? All right. And Jesus says in John 14, if you love me, what will you do? Keep my commandments. Okay. And so the promise of the Lord is tied into the fulfilling of the commandments of the Lord. So obviously, those who love or loved his appearing, they will be doing what God has told them to do. So finally, question 7, how do the words of the whole letter, and especially these first 8 verses, give us a glimpse at what the thoughts of Paul were as he neared the end of his life? What was still foremost in Paul's mind? The word of truth being presented, yeah. That Timothy remained faithful in that teaching and preaching, and obviously that Timothy remained faithful to the Lord, certainly, but that the gospel continued to be taught. And certainly that's a part of the second part of question 7. What did he feel was of most importance, considering this was his last letter to Timothy? Obviously, that encouragement to Timothy to continue to endure persecution is already something that Paul has dealt with earlier in 2 Timothy. But also that he maintained the faithfulness that Paul himself has given Timothy the example to do, to continue to endure persecutions, to fight the good fight, to finish the race and keep the faith. Those are the kind of the implied applications for Timothy as Paul writes this. Certainly Paul's expressing his confidence that it is all worth it, but there's also kind of an unspoken call to Timothy for him to do the same. All right. Anything through verse 8 before we get into verse 9? All right. So let's get into verse 9 of our study here. And also, by the way, so the notes, verses 9 through 13 are what are covered on today's notes. And the last part of the notes are on the table. That's verses 14 through 22, which, Lord willing, we will cover next Sunday. So those notes are on that table in the foyer, and I will email those out as well. So starting in verse 9, be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for the ministry, or for ministry. All right, so really those first 8 verses here in chapter 4, there's kind of a pivot point between verse 8 and verse 9. Verse 9 is going to address very specific, in fact, here in these last several verses, Paul mentions several individuals by name, both in a good and both in a positive and a negative context. But these are very specific directions from Paul, especially as Paul's looking forward to seeing Timothy. So as Paul says in verse 9, be diligent to come to me quickly. Certainly Paul is anticipating his death soon, but not necessarily tomorrow. Okay, certainly the hope is that Timothy will be able to arrive in Rome to see Paul before Paul dies. I think that's what Paul's hope is, and I'm certain that Timothy had the same hope. But notice why. Okay, why Paul is hoping to see Timothy. Obviously not in addition to being able to impart some kind of final encouragement or final words of teaching or whatnot. Verse 10, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. All right, now it's interesting because a lot of times it's a little bit confusing because sometimes people will associate Crescens and Titus as well as being a part of whatever this is that Demas had gotten involved in. I tend to think that that's not the case. I tend to think that Demas was the one who had forsaken Paul, but that Crescens had gone to Galatia, presumably to teach. Titus had gone to Dalmatia, presumably to teach. Not that they had forsaken Paul in a negative way, but that they went to teach. However, Demas apparently did. This term, he has forsaken me having loved this present world. Now this is in a negative context, what's being said about Demas. This is agape, or agapeo specifically, and this is a ever-present affection, willing to give of himself. Paul says for the present world. And of course that kind of gives an impression on, obviously in general, you could make that statement about any sin, but what might be a situation where Demas has found himself in, where Paul might say this, not necessarily that Demas had completely turned away from Jesus to live a life of sin, but what other scenario might also explain why Paul says this? What's one of the, in context, what's one of the things that Paul has been encouraging Timothy to beware of and to do? Especially back in chapter 1 and chapter 2. What was Timothy facing? Wasn't he facing persecution? Okay. Now, couldn't the temptation be that in the face of persecution to yield to those who were making demands, to attempt to appease those who were seeking to stop an individual from teaching the truth, similar to what Paul even refers to in chapter 4 there at the beginning about those Christians who would no longer hear the truth? Okay, it has been suggested that perhaps Demas maybe not, and again, it's possible that he completely forsook the Lord in addition to forsaking Paul by turning into a life of sin, completely forsaking the gospel. But that there's a possibility here that Demas, because he wasn't willing to suffer persecution, that he was willing to compromise the truth of the gospel, that he wasn't willing to speak and say what needed to be said, and he didn't want to be associated with Paul. And obviously, because Paul was in prison, he's in Rome. Maybe Demas didn't want to draw the attention of Caesar or whatever. Perhaps he was scared. But that has been suggested. And regardless of whether this is a full forsaking, as in turning completely away from Jesus, what Paul says is Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. And so it suggests that at the very least, Demas did not want to be associated with Paul, perhaps for fear of being persecuted as well. And that is a consideration. And I think that certainly would carry significant application for Timothy, given the fact that Paul's been encouraging Timothy to continue to be faithful. Paul even says in chapter 1 of 2 Timothy not to be ashamed of Paul in his chains, whereas apparently Demas was. Thoughts on Demas? Yes, sir.
Again, within the context, I would describe Demas as being short-sighted, whereas Paul's just been writing about departing, judgment, crown of life, things eternal. That's the push. And Demas, something in this present world, he's short-sighted. His vision is the here and now.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Because certainly as the danger of the distractions, whether it's persecution or trials that we face in life, the danger of those distractions is that it will bring us to short-sightedness, that we will only focus on the now and our whatever the infirmity may be or the persecution may be or the temptation may be, and not think about the full picture as Paul paints it here to Timothy. So that's a great application, certainly, that Demas, whatever the case was for which Demas is being addressed or kind of indirectly addressed by to Timothy by Paul, the case is that, he was short-sighted in whatever regard that was that what he did. Anything else about Demas? I think this is why Paul, he doesn't say, for Demas and Crescens and Titus have forsaken me, having loved this present world. I know there are some who say, well, it could be Crescens and Titus also did that, but there's no other reference to Crescens or, for that matter, Titus turning away from Paul specifically. And so I have always read this as Paul's addressing the fact that at some point Demas had been there and no longer wanted to be associated with Paul, but Crescens and Titus had left Paul, not because they were ashamed of him, presumably, but to teach the gospel. And that's kind of how I have taken that as well. Anything through verse 10?
Why would Paul give the location of Demas departing? I'm not disputing what he said. I'm
Yeah, I think certainly I think there's an application to be drawn for the fact that if Demas, and again, presuming Demas has been unwilling to associate himself with Paul in the midst of Paul's imprisonment, Demas perhaps ran away. Okay, and so certainly I think perhaps there might be some application there, for he's gone to Thessalonica. Whether Timothy ever has further contact with Demas or has the opportunity to speak to Demas, perhaps that might be why Paul includes that. If if he's in Thessalonica and you happen to be in Thessalonica, that might be a situation to be aware of. And that's why Paul certainly specifies Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus has gone to Dalmatia. It's also interesting that Thessalonica was a city, not a region, as opposed to Galatia and Dalmatia. Those are not cities, those are regions. Whether that's significant or not, again, that tends to suggest to me that at least on Crescens and Titus's end, it was for the purpose of teaching in that region. Just like Paul and Barnabas and Paul and Silas went up into those regions and taught in Phrygia and so forth. These weren't just the specific, and we know the specific cities they went to, but they taught in those regions. Demas, again, the direct purpose for why he mentions departing to Thessalonica, again, my best thought is that maybe Demas just didn't want to be associated with Paul's imprisonment. He was perhaps ashamed or didn't want to be take the chance of being persecuted with Paul, and so perhaps he ran away to Thessalonica. And again, if Timothy had the opportunity to speak to Demas about this or whatnot, but it certainly gives a negative connotation here, or sinful connotation. Yes, sir.
I agree along those lines. I don't know, but it seems to tie in with the specificity of he has forsaken me. There's something in a specific Thessalonica that's drawing him.
That could be too.
Whereas these other two, I'm with you, I think they're going on to preach the gospel, which is
Yeah.
areas, regions.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the fact that maybe there was something in Thessalonica that was drawing Demas. That could be. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, good point.
And to that, Paul, in this second point in these 3 or 4 verses, I'm here by myself.
Yeah.
I still need some help, some ministers and servants around. So it's not like he ran to Burke and could be right back. He's
Yeah.
gone to this point for a specific reason. He's gone.
Yeah, he's not coming back, as far as Paul knows. Yeah, and that's kind of the heels of verse 9. Be diligent to come to me quickly. Why? Because, Demas has forsaken me. There's something he wants more than to teach the gospel or to suffer for the cause of the gospel or whatever it may be. But Crescens isn't here. Titus isn't here. They've gone, presumably, to teach the gospel. He's all alone except for Luke, verse 11. Only Luke is with me. That's not to say, in fact, Paul's even going to address the fact that the brethren in Rome are greeting the saints in Ephesus and in these other places. It's not to say that the brethren aren't there to encourage Paul, but in terms of a companion there to assist Paul in a day-to-day situation, only Luke is there. Now, that being the case, that actually ties into one of our questions. We have, question 4. What 2 reasons would Luke being with Paul, or be with him, be helpful for Paul? I can think of at least 2 reasons as to why that would be helpful for Paul, for Luke to be there. Okay, he's a physician. Yeah, that's one of the things we know about Luke, is that by trade he was a physician. And certainly Paul had some physical ailments. Certainly in the Galatian letter, Galatians chapter 4, there's discussion about his eyes, that perhaps there was some kind of issue he had with his eyes, even to the point that at times he couldn't write physically the letters. He had to speak it, and it was transcribed by somebody, like the Roman letter, for instance. But the other situations, some have suggested even the thorn in the flesh. If it wasn't the situation with his eyes, whatever thorn in the flesh he may have had that he asked the Lord to take away from him 3 times, to which God finally replied, no, my grace is sufficient for you. Regardless, and then just the fact that he's in prison. Okay, and certainly that's not going to necessarily be a pleasant stay, especially in his second imprisonment. His first imprisonment, at least at the end of Acts, sounded more like house arrest than it did imprison in the sense of like we think of jail. However, as far as we know, the second imprisonment was jail, it sounds like. So certainly, Luke being with Paul for the benefit of having that, certainly the physician aid, and obviously as well for the encouragement of Luke being a brother in Christ, certainly would be the other one. Yes, sir.
You're asking about Luke, as he described in introduction of the Gospel of Luke, he's an eyewitness of all these things, he's got this perfect understanding, so background and things that maybe Paul's heard reference of, or read about, or heard an account about. Here's a guy that was there when it happened, and tell him things about Jesus, or how that conversation went, or what he taught. It's good for him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Doug?
Last week we studied Paul talked about possibly about his peace. And it sounds like here he's putting everything in line with Lord.
Yeah.
He's getting ready to get everything taken care of that he's getting taken care of these last few verses. Get his life ready to go so that he can be how to carry on, how to keep going. I'm not around. I'm taking care of you. And this letter is saying for us today, with the same thing that we can do in our life. Set things where we keep the work going.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And today it may, putting affairs in order may involve legal documents, it may involve making phone calls and that sort of thing. But, I mean, you want to talk about snail mail, okay? This was snail mail, all right? This was long, hard traveling, especially from Ephesus to Rome and so forth. I mean, this was a long ordeal. So obviously this was something that Paul is being forward thinking about and trying to get all these affairs in order, like Doug mentioned. Yeah. All right. So as we noticed on Wednesday night talking about John Mark, only Luke is with me, he says in verse 11, get Mark, that would be John Mark, and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. Again, Paul's attention is on ministry. It's not on encouraging me, okay? Paul doesn't say, bring John Mark. I want him to encourage me. Obviously, that would be a given. I think that John Mark would be an encouragement to Paul, as would Timothy and as would Luke. But Paul's focus, once again, is on continuing to teach the gospel, making arrangements to make sure that others are going to teach the gospel as he's about to die. So that certainly has a part of it as well. Anything through verse 11?
So somehow he's learned of John Mark's transformation, or he has at least changed enough in Paul's opinion, where now he wants him there.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Paul is willing to let that change happen, and he's okay.
And Paul was not so proud. I don't think there was pride involved in the sharp disagreement in Acts 15 either. But Paul was not so decidedly against John Mark that he wasn't able to acknowledge that John Mark had made, or obviously had changed or had grown up, had matured, had shown himself to be, willing to teach the truth, even if it at the potential of persecution. Whatever was involved, and granted, between the situation that takes place in Acts chapter 14 or so, or I guess 14, where he left them at Perga, and now, we're talking maybe between 15 and 20 years. So obviously, John Mark has had some opportunity to mature and to grow, but it is notable that Paul makes that statement, for he is useful to me. And that stands out because at one time, Paul questioned his usefulness. And now, obviously, John Mark has proven that he is willing to stand for the truth and to suffer persecution if need be. And that's the assumption that John Mark left Perga because he was afraid. We don't know that. Paul doesn't specify that, and neither does Luke in the book of Acts. But that is we're assuming that was the case with John Mark. Any,
Two things maybe we touched on a little again Wednesday night. There's nothing at that point that there's anything about John Mark that was wrong or sinful.
right.
It was a judgment about, is he fit or ready for this work and that kind of thing or not.
Right.
Times have changed, and also situation from Acts 14 to this, it's a different setting. It's a different, maybe he wasn't good at travel and all that involved and the persecution and all we talked about then, but in this, I know things aren't going well with Paul, but a more peaceful, one location setting that he can handle and be useful and beneficial.
Yeah. And there's something to be said for the fact that not everyone is good at everything. Not every teacher or preacher is good in every situation or every scenario that arises. Certain elders, in fact, one of the reasons why you have the example, the elders that we do, is that, some of these men who are to be elders, a lot of them have experience in different areas. And that helps to kind of, broaden that ability to draw wisdom in deciding how best to deal with a situation. And so a lot of times different individuals will be better at this thing or that thing than maybe something else. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's certainly, we should be willing to grow and push ourselves even outside our comfort zone sometimes, certainly. But, that I hadn't thought about that John Mark, maybe there had kind of maybe there were just certain things that he wasn't as adept at as others. And maybe this is one of those things he would have been adept at. And that could be. That could be. Yeah. Anything else through verse 11? All right, verse 12, we find that Paul had Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. For what reason he had sent Tychicus to Ephesus? Maybe it was to spell Timothy so that Timothy could then come and brethren in Ephesus weren't without someone there to help teach the gospel and so forth. Regardless, there are a total of 4 individuals who at one point were with Paul but then left. And that's what question 2 was all about. Demas, Crescens, Titus, and Tychicus are those 4. And, we talked about the reasons and so forth. But it's interesting that Paul, writing to Timothy, which presumably Timothy is still in or around Ephesus, he's being told Tychicus is being sent to Ephesus. Verse 13, he says, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Now, in verse 21, Paul's going to mention the fact that winter is going to arrive relatively soon, and Paul's hoping Timothy will arrive by winter, before winter. Now, obviously, being in a Roman jail during winter certainly isn't going to be pleasant. So perhaps that is the reason for the mention of the cloak in verse 13. But notice what was most important to Paul. Of the material things that Paul's asking Timothy to bring, what was most important? Parchments. What these parchments were or books were, we don't know. I tend to think it probably had something to do with the Old Testament. Okay, that would be my guess. But Paul doesn't specify as to what these parchments were. Maybe they were letters from some of the other apostles. Maybe they were correspondence with some other brethren. We don't know. But it's interesting to kind of, you've got this little slice of insight into some kind of a situation that existed. Paul, for some reason, left a cloak with Carpus at Troas. Was this when Paul was at Troas before, as recorded in Acts? Was this a different trip? Why did he leave it there? I mean, these are just these little glimpses of things that we have that remind us that these individuals were human beings. They lived their lives just as we're doing now. There were day-to-day things that they had to take care of and deal with, just as we do. Okay, these aren't just people on a page. These were real-life people who had to deal with sometimes just the ordinary types of things like I need my cloak and I need the books and the parchments. Bring those with you when you come. So I just think it's interesting. A lot of times this kind of gets read over because there's nothing really being taught necessarily in verse 13. But at the same time, it gives kind of a little bit of a dash of humanity, remembering that these are human beings. Anything through verse 13? Yes, sir.
A small point also, but it brings into account the idea of service that Timothy can remember. It's not a big thing.
Right.
It doesn't always have to be a big thing that we do in service
Yeah.
for someone else, but it's still for the Lord.
That's a great point. That's an excellent point. Something relatively small and minor that is easy for us to overlook. It was yet another opportunity for Timothy to do something for Paul. Yeah. I mean, and even if it's something of a physical nature like this, okay, bringing a cloak, bringing the books and the parchments, that is still serving a brother in Christ who has asked for assistance in this matter. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, Joe. Anything else through verse 13? Yes, sir.
Again, we don't know. It seems maybe a sense of, as Paul's near the end of his life, and like I said, putting all these things in order, he's still thinking about the gospel and the spread of it. So is there a sense that he's, I've prepared Crescens and Tychicus and these guys now and sent them out, although, as you said, it's kind of sent 4 guys away. He still needs some help. Now bring Timothy, bring John Mark in. How can I further train and prepare them for their ongoing work after Paul's gone?
Absolutely. Well, and I don't know, we don't know how much contact Paul and John Mark had, for instance, after Acts 15. It may be that Paul had seen them on a regular occasion. Maybe he hadn't seen him since Acts 15 and the events of Acts 15. And so certainly for John Mark, being able to see Paul, just think about the impact on John Mark that would have. First of all, to be told that Paul wants me to take you with me to Rome because Paul feels that you are useful to him in the ministry. I mean, just that in of itself would be an encouragement. I mean, not that Paul was, exalted above what he should be, but he was an apostle. Okay, and certainly, given the past history between Paul and John Mark, certainly that would encourage John Mark. Just knowing that Paul wants me there. Maybe Paul wants to encourage John Mark. Maybe he wants to, help equip him in some way to be able to continue to teach the gospel, whatever it was. Certainly those individuals being sent out, presumably, Paul's not going to see any of those individuals again. And so now it's going to be Luke and Timothy and John Mark. So, yeah.
He's busy writing a couple of books.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. That too. Yeah. All right. Anything else through verse 13? All right. All right. So that ends our notes for verses 9 through 13. We're going to go ahead and get into verse 14 a little bit. Again, this information, or some of the more detailed look at this, is on our notes for next week. Starting at verse 14, Paul says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must beware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. So verse 14, Alexander the coppersmith. The name Alexander comes up on a fairly regular occasion in the New Testament. There's an example of an Alexander who was a Jew of reputation. It sounds as though this Alexander, especially given the fact that Alexander is a very Gentile name, it sounds as perhaps this Alexander may be a different one that is referenced in, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, and I think there's one other place in Acts that an Alexander is mentioned. Regardless, this Alexander was a coppersmith. And there is an example of an Alexander who was a Christian, also mentioned in the book of Acts. Whether or not this is the same man, we don't know. But the fact is, Paul says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. And then Paul warns Timothy about Alexander. Now, I don't know where Alexander is a coppersmith, what city he's in, if he's in Ephesus. If he's in Rome, we don't know where he's at. But Paul has a specific purpose for mentioning Alexander. But it's interesting that Paul says he did me much harm. Well, we know that he was resisting the truth. It's possible that Alexander was even violent with Paul as Paul taught the gospel. Certainly in Ephesus, there was a silversmith and a whole host of metal workers who got upset. Why? All right, they were making statues of Diana, and as Paul's teaching about the one true God, this is a major threat to their livelihoods. And so, was his name Demetrius, the silversmith? Okay, was one of the main ringleaders who kind of got that thing going. But it's very possible that since Paul specifies a coppersmith, it's possible that this individual was also there in Ephesus when all of that went down, and is one of those individuals perhaps who, while not mentioned by name by Luke in the book of Acts, may very well have been a part of that situation. And whether that harm came from, and I tend to think that Paul's referencing physical harm or persecution here. Certainly there's other types of harm, but I tend to think, especially if we're talking about Ephesus, we're talking about some kind of physical harm. But then notice what Paul says immediately after that. May the Lord repay him according to his works. One of our questions on our notes is going to be, is Paul wishing ill will upon Alexander the coppersmith? Is he wishing evil upon him? And if so, how does that harmonize with the fact that we're not to wish ill will or be malicious towards others? Like, depending on how you read this, if you read this in a certain tense, you could almost hear somebody saying with anger or even hatred, may the Lord repay him. Is that what Paul's doing here? Yes, sir.
Well, the statement, we're all to be rewarded for our works. So that's throughout the New Testament, whether good or bad.
Right.
To me, it would be contrary, because it's not about Paul himself. You read into the next verse, it's about him withstanding our teachings, our preachings.
Okay.
That was the source of the ill will, if you will, about this particular gentleman.
Okay.
And that's why, if it had only been about Paul, why write to Timothy about it? You wouldn't bother Timothy. No, if you come and preach the same things, you need to be aware of this guy. He's going to be a danger or a threat, or whatever you call it.
Okay. To be aware of it, but does that mean to not teach even if Alexander's out there listening? Okay. Timothy has to be prepared to teach regardless, right? So when Paul makes a statement, may the Lord repay him according to his works, is this precluding the possibility that maybe Alexander might repent and become a Christian, or repent and return to the Lord? Is Paul hoping that he doesn't become saved? I think it's like, as Nolan said, the attention here from Paul he's not the type of hold a grudge, hey, you hurt me, and I hope that you are condemned at judgment because you hurt me. In the book of Revelation, okay, Jesus writes this letter to those 7 churches of Asia to inform them that all those who bring about hurt and death upon his people will be punished. While we should not be glad that souls are going to be condemned, is it a comfort to know that those things don't go unnoticed by God? That God will take note of those who hurt his people, who persecute his people, that God will bring them to an account? Okay, I believe that is exactly what the letter of Revelation, it's really what it is, letter of Revelation from Jesus to these churches, to let them know, don't worry about what these people do to you. Okay, God, ultimately, is Christ at Judgment Day. I will repay. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Cinda?
So the ESV says the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. I think that's a very different connotation.
Oh, as opposed to I hope or may the Lord. Yeah. The Lord will repay. Yeah, and I think that carries that idea that it's Paul stating a fact. Okay, and depending on especially if the Lord will repay him. I mean, if you look at it that way, Paul could almost offer that as a warning in the sense that the Lord's going to repay him, and that's sad that that's the case. Because Paul was never one to place his own personal pride or getting back at somebody over a person's soul. Okay, Israel continually persecuted him, yet what does he say in Romans chapter 10, verse 1? My heart and prayer is that Israel may be what? Saved. And yet Israel was persecuting him. I mean, Jews all over the place were going from city to city trying to get him in trouble. And yet it was still his prayer that Israel be saved. And so I don't believe what we're seeing here in verse 14 is Paul being malicious or Paul asking God, stoke the fire for him or something like that. I think what we're hearing from Paul is the fact that it's a declaration, is that God will repay those who trouble his people. And that's a fact. That it's a sad fact. Okay, it shouldn't cause us glee, but at the same time, it is a comfort to know that nothing goes unnoticed by the Lord and that God will take vengeance. In fact, does Paul say that he will take vengeance or that Paul will finally be vindicated? Is it ever about Paul?
He's just acknowledging that I don't have time for this, that God's going to take care of it, but this guy can make a problem for you, carry on to do the work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not about Paul, and it's about the teaching of the gospel. That's why he says in verse 15, you also must beware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. Again, whether this man was a citizen in Ephesus, or if he's now in Rome, or has always been in Rome, regardless, this guy has been a thorn in Paul's side. Paul tells Timothy, watch out for him. He'll be a thorn in your side. But in the end, whose job is it to repay? It's not Paul's and it's not Timothy's. It's God's. God will render to each one according to their works. And unfortunately, Alexander will be judged for his. And that's, I believe, Paul here, that's kind of the connotation, is that it's unfortunate that Alexander will lose his soul, but that is one of the comforts we have as the people of God, is that God sees all things, and that these things do not go unnoticed when his people are hurt by someone. Yes, sir?
Jumping ahead of verse 16, he's going to kind of circle around. Demas, who forsook me, until the time when all men forsook me, but I don't want God to lay that to the charge. He didn't have any personal ill will
Right.
coming from Paul.
Right. And for that matter, I mean, Demas having forsaken him, is Paul wishing ill will on Demas? Or is Paul giving Timothy information? And for that matter, is Paul gossiping about Demas? Is he gossiping about Alexander? I mean, gossip, whether it's true or not, are words that are told to another with the effort of kind of causing the view of someone to be lesser than what it is, to kind of tear down somebody. Whether they're true or not, what's being said. Okay, is this gossip from Paul? Or is this information Timothy needs? I think it's information Timothy needs. Don't fall into the same trap Demas did, and you need to be aware that you may face a problem with Alexander, either in Ephesus or in Rome, or at some point, because Timothy's going to be around him at some point. All right, everybody, we'll stop there. We will pick up here verse 15 and 16. Next week, again, those final notes are on the back table. Between now and next Sunday, please be thinking about whether or not we want to go into a different study completely, a different book, Old or New Testament, a topic, if we want to do a book that's already been put together with questions and so forth, or if we want to go into Titus. That was my original plan, was to go from 2 Timothy into Titus. This kind of flows together, but we don't have to do that. So it's whatever y'all want to do. So be thinking about that, and we'll discuss that more next Sunday. Thank you, everybody.